There comes a moment in a human life when you begin to sense, not with panic, but with a quiet and uncomfortable clarity, that the person you have spent years presenting to the world was never truly you, that the identity you defended was stitched together from expectations, fears, and the desperate need to belong. It starts subtly, in the conversations that drain you, in the roles you can no longer perform without feeling a faint tremor of dishonesty, and slowly you realize that the self you have carried has become too heavy, too artificial, too rehearsed to be a home for your spirit. No one tells you that transformation does not begin with improvement but with erosion, with the slow peeling away of everything you adopted to survive, as if life were whispering that before you become anything real, you must first release everything false. The world around you will misunderstand this unraveling and will call it withdrawal or change. Yet beneath their interpretation, something sacred is happening. A soft demolition of the protective layers that once kept you safe but now keep you small. And in the quiet that follows, you begin to understand that unbecoming is not the collapse of who you are, but the clearing of space for the self you abandoned long ago to finally return. The process of unbecoming begins the moment you realize that the self you have carried through the years is not a fixed truth but a temporary construction, shaped more by circumstance than by essence, built slowly and silently from the expectations of others, the wounds you never examined, and the choices you made before you understood you were making them. It is a strange awakening, because for most of your life you believed identity was something solid, something earned or chosen or inherited. Yet as you move deeper into your inner world, you begin to see that much of who you are is a collage of reactions, defenses, and compromises, formed long before you had the power to question them. For centuries, philosophers have warned us that the self is not a monolith but a layered illusion, a shifting arrangement of stories told to protect us from the chaos of existing without a clear narrative, and yet we cling to these stories because they offer structure, even when the structure becomes a cage. Jung spoke of the masks we wear, the personas crafted to navigate a world that rewards conformity over truth. And you start to feel the weight of those masks when they no longer align with the quiet shape of your inner reality. Unbecoming is the philosophical recognition that identity is not something you are, but something you perform. And that performance, once useful, begins to decay the moment you no longer believe in the character you are playing. The discomfort you feel is not dysfunction, but the first tremor of truth, the soul pushing against the boundaries of an old narrative that can no longer contain its depth, its contradictions, or its hunger for something more honest. In this early stage of unbecoming, nothing changes on the outside, yet everything feels different on the inside, as if the scaffolding holding your life together has begun to loosen. And though it is frightening, it is also the first step toward freedom. Because before you can return to yourself, you must see clearly the architecture of the self that was built for you, and acknowledge the painful reality that the life you are living may not be the life that belongs to your spirit. And so the foundation of unbecoming is not a dramatic transformation, but a philosophical surrender, a quiet willingness to question the story you have been told about who you are, knowing that truth, once invited, rarely arrives gently and never leaves you unchanged. The psychology of unbecoming begins with the quiet recognition that the mind you inhabit is a museum of borrowed impressions, a collection of internalized voices that have whispered instructions into your identity long before you learned to speak your own truth. And as you examine these inner rooms, you start to see that much of your suffering comes not from who you are, but from who you believed you were required to be. The human psyche, shaped by early survival and the need to be accepted, learns to split itself into fragments, one part carried forward as the public self, and another buried quietly as the private self, the self that remembers what you wanted before you learned what was permitted. And this division, though subtle, becomes the foundation of lifelong tension. We grow into adults who no longer recognize the original desires that once animated us, because psychological conditioning has taught us that safety is earned through compliance, through predictability, through shrinking parts of ourselves to preserve relationships that would not survive if we showed our full interior truth. In this way, the false self becomes a psychological armor, protecting the fragile and unformed parts of the psyche. Yet over time, the armor becomes heavier than the vulnerability it was meant to defend, and you begin to feel the internal cost of maintaining a version of yourself you no longer believe in. Jung wrote that the shadow contains everything we once exiled in order to be acceptable, and as you enter the journey of unbecoming, the shadow begins to surface, not to punish you but to reintegrate the pieces of your story that were abandoned when you were too young to defend them. You start to feel the inherited beliefs that have shaped your choices, the quiet scripts that taught you to endure rather than to question, to serve rather than to desire, to minimize rather than to express. And it becomes clear that much of your adult life has been a psychological repetition of patterns formed in the earliest chapters of your existence. Unbecoming requires looking directly at these patterns without flinching, without rationalizing, without turning away from the ways you learn to betray yourself in order to maintain the illusion of harmony with others. And this honesty feels like standing without armor for the first time in decades. As illusions fall away, you notice how your nervous system has been conditioned to mistake tension for normalcy, silence for safety, self-abandonment for love. And realizing this creates a disorientation that feels almost like grief, because in a way you are grieving the years spent living as a stranger to your own inner world. This psychological unraveling is not chaos but clarity, the slow and deliberate recognition that the identity you outgrew was built upon foundations too narrow to support the weight of who you are becoming. And it is only by examining these inner structures that you can begin to release them. And so the breakdown is not a fall, but a turning inward, the beginning of a long and necessary dialogue with the parts of yourself you once thought you had to silence, revealing that the true crisis is not the loss of identity, but the fear of discovering who you might become without the burden of the old one. There is a story, not of one person but of many, woven through the quiet corners of countless lives, a story that unfolds slowly in the background long before anyone realizes it has begun, and it begins with a life that looks perfectly ordinary from the outside, a life built with the careful precision of someone who wanted nothing more than to be good, to be acceptable, to be harmless in a world that never asked who they might become if they were allowed to be anything at all. They lived as most people do, following the invisible map handed to them in childhood, shaping themselves according to the unspoken rules of family, culture, duty, and silent fears, learning early that certain emotions must be swallowed, certain thoughts must be hidden, certain desires must be reduced to something manageable and polite. With time, they became admired for their reliability, praised for their stability, valued for their ability to endure without complaint. But beneath the surface they felt a faint emptiness echoing through the habits of their days, an ache that could not be explained by exhaustion alone. They began noticing quiet moments where their reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger rehearsing familiarity, and conversations felt scripted, and achievements felt suspiciously hollow, as though each milestone marked not progress but distance from a self that was drifting further out of reach. Yet they continued, because continuing was what they had always done, and the world rewarded them for this continuity, mistaking their obedience for contentment and their silence for wisdom, never seeing the quiet fracture growing beneath the routines of their days. One evening, after another day spent performing the version of themselves that others expected, they found themselves sitting alone in a dimly lit room, the kind of stillness that reveals things too honest to confront during daylight settling around them, and in that silence came a realization almost too fragile to name. They had built a life that made sense to everyone except the person living it. It was not a dramatic revelation, not a cinematic breakdown, simply a soft collapse of certainty, a moment when the scaffolding of their identity loosened just enough for truth to slip through the cracks and touch the part of them that had been waiting, patiently and painfully, for acknowledgement. They understood then that the emptiness they felt was not failure but misalignment, the natural ache of living as a collection of adaptations rather than as a coherent self. And as this understanding settled deeper, they felt grief rising. Not grief for what had been lost, but grief for what had never been allowed to exist. In that quiet room, they realized that unbecoming does not begin with liberation, but with mourning, with the sorrow of recognizing how many years had been devoted to constructing a life that was too small for the vastness hidden inside them. They sat in the stillness, letting the truth settle like dust across the forgotten corners of their mind. And for the first time, they did not try to fix themselves, or justify themselves, or explain themselves. They simply witnessed themselves, and in that witnessing, something old and burdened began to loosen. The story ends not with resolution, but with a doorway, a quiet threshold where the person who once lived by obligation takes their first hesitant breath as someone who might finally choose to live by truth. And though nothing changes in the room or in the world outside, everything changes within them as the faint and fragile possibility emerges that the life they were meant to inhabit has been waiting all along, just beyond the walls of the self they are beginning to outgrow. The darkest truth of unbecoming is that most people will never cross the threshold you are approaching, not because they lack intelligence or desire, but because authenticity demands a kind of inner death that few are willing to experience. A shedding of identities so deeply entwined with survival that letting them go feels indistinguishable from losing one's place in the world. We cling to our constructed selves because they have protected us, because they have given us names to answer to, roles to play, and a sense of belonging, however fragile. And when the moment arrives to loosen that grip, we mistake the trembling of our spirit for danger, as if stepping toward truth were somehow more threatening than living indefinitely inside a lie. The uncomfortable reality is that the world does not reward authenticity. It rewards predictability, usefulness, conformity, and most of what society praises as strength is often just endurance for a life that does not fit, a quiet tolerance for the slow suffocation of the soul. Many people sense this misalignment, but retreat into routine rather than confrontation, into distraction rather than introspection, because the mind is skilled at constructing layers of complexity around simple truths when those truths are too painful to face directly. The truth you uncover during unbecoming is not heroic or poetic, but unsettling in its clarity. Your suffering was not an accident of fate, but the natural consequence of betraying your inner world, for long enough that it eventually began to fracture beneath the weight of your compromises. And although everyone speaks of transformation as if it were a journey toward greater light, the real journey begins in darkness, in the raw uncertainty of dismantling the internal architecture that once made your life feel coherent, knowing that the moment you stop pretending, you lose the comfort of familiar illusions. This is the truth most avoid, that authenticity asks for a price long before it offers a reward, stripping away relationships built upon your old identity, unraveling habits that once numbed you, and exposing the uncomfortable gap between the life you show the world and the one you quietly endure. To unbecome is to accept that the self you are losing was never truly yours, but it is also to confront the lonely reality that very few people will understand the changes taking place within you, because your transformation threatens the agreements they made with their own illusions. And so the dark truth lies in this paradox. You must be willing to disappoint the world in order to stop disappointing your soul. And until that willingness becomes stronger than your fear of being misunderstood, you remain a prisoner of the self you outgrew long ago. This is the quiet brutality of awakening, the moment you see clearly that freedom was never out of reach, only out of permission, and that the permission you were waiting for was always meant to come from within. Transformation does not arrive with the force of revelation, nor with the triumphant clarity promised by those who speak of growth as if it were a sunrise waiting behind every hardship. Instead, it begins almost imperceptibly, as a subtle rearrangement of your inner landscape, where the parts of you that once hid in the shadows step forward with a cautious, almost reluctant curiosity. You notice small changes long before the world does. Changes in the way your thoughts no longer clamp down around old fears, in the way your body relaxes when you refuse to perform a version of yourself that once felt necessary to maintain peace, in the way your voice softens when it returns to its natural cadence after years of bending itself into shapes meant to reassure others. This evolution feels less like becoming someone new and more like remembering someone ancient, someone who existed before the layers of adaptation were stitched into your identity, someone who spoke softly within you long before you had the courage to listen. There is no sudden replacement of the old self, only a gradual loosening, as if you were untying knots that have tightened over decades, knots made from silence, obligation, and the countless small betrayals you committed against yourself under the illusion that doing so was noble. And as these knots loosen, the space they once occupied fills with something unfamiliar, not confidence exactly, but a kind of quiet honesty, an inner stillness that does not demand recognition or approval because it arises from a place untouched by the world's shifting opinions. You begin to make choices not from fear or habit, but from alignment, choosing conversations that nourish rather than drain, relationships that breathe rather than bind, actions that reflect not who you should be, but who you have slowly begun to reclaim. This transformation is not loud because loudness belongs to the old self, the self that performed strength to avoid collapse. True evolution is quiet, measured, grounded, and in its quietude you discover that clarity does not rush. It reveals itself slowly as you dismantle the noise that once dictated your direction. There will be moments of doubt, nights when the old identity tries to return, whispering that authenticity is too risky, too lonely, too uncertain. But those whispers begin to lose authority as your inner world strengthens, and you start to understand that the most profound transformations are not dramatic ruptures, but steady recalibrations of what you accept, what you allow, and what you can no longer pretend to be. The self that emerges is not the polished, triumphant figure you once imagined becoming, but something better, a self that is real, unadorned, incomplete, yet undeniably alive. A self that no longer sacrifices its truth for the comfort of others. A self that breathes with a rhythm that finally matches the beat of your inner world. And as this evolution deepens, you realize that unbecoming was never about destruction. It was about making space, clearing the remnants of a life built on adaptation so the architecture of authenticity could finally rise in the slow, deliberate silence that accompanies all things meant to endure. In this unfolding, you begin to sense that the life ahead of you will not be easier, but it will be truer. And somewhere in that truth, you find a strange, steady kind of peace that feels like the first real home you have ever known. When you reach the deeper stages of unbecoming, something shifts that is not emotional or psychological, but existential, as if you were stepping into a realm beneath your personal story. A place where the experiences of your life dissolve into patterns older than you, patterns that echo through philosophy, myth, and the unconscious architecture of the human mind. And you begin to understand that your unraveling is not a personal failure, but a universal passage, a threshold every soul must cross if it wishes to evolve beyond imitation and into truth. Seneca wrote that life is not short but wasted when spent in the service of illusions. And in your clearing you finally grasp what he meant, seeing how many years were dedicated to maintaining a narrative you outgrew, how much precious time slipped through your fingers while you negotiated with expectations that were never aligned with your inner nature. Nietzsche spoke of becoming who you are, not as an instruction but as an ordeal, a process that requires the destruction of inherited identities, the confrontation of your own abyss, and the willingness to stand in empty space long enough for a new meaning to form. And you realize that your unbecoming is the beginning of this ordeal, the sacred dismantling needed before creation can occur. Jung knew this territory intimately. He understood that the shadow, the forgotten self, the inner exile, must be welcomed back before a person can feel whole. and you begin to sense that your purpose is not to build a better mask, but to integrate the parts of you that were once pushed into silence, so that the self who emerges is not fragmented, but unified, not socially acceptable, but internally coherent. In this deeper understanding, life appears less chaotic. You see how suffering becomes a teacher when approached without resistance, how disappointment exposes the false paths you were never meant to follow, how loneliness reveals the parts of you that were abandoned in exchange for belonging, and the meaning that arises from this recognition is quieter than the ambitions you once chased. You begin to sense that unbecoming is not only a personal liberation, but a return to the ancient rhythm of human existence, the rhythm of shedding what time has distorted, reconnecting with the inner voice that culture drowned, stepping out of narratives written by others and returning to the blank page of your own becoming. And in this space, purpose stops feeling like a distant prize and becomes something simpler, something grounded, something almost monastic. The ongoing alignment between inner truth and outer action, the refusal to betray yourself for acceptance, the steady movement toward a life that does not require the constant compromise of your integrity. You start to see that meaning is not found in achievement, but in congruence, not in external validation, but in internal coherence, not in becoming someone admirable, but in becoming someone real. And in this quiet realization, you discover a purpose that does not depend on the world's approval, a purpose rooted in authenticity rather than ambition. And as this understanding settles deeper into your bones, you recognize that unbecoming was never an ending, but an initiation, a slow and necessary descent into the interior of your own existence, so that what rises afterward is not the self shaped by survival, but the self shaped by truth, a self that finally belongs to you and no one else. In the final quiet of this journey, when the noise of your former identity has faded and the world no longer pulls at you with the same urgency, you begin to sense a stillness within that feels both unfamiliar and ancient, as if you were stepping into the first moments of your life with the eyes of someone who has finally awakened from a long and complicated dream. What once felt like loss now feels like spaciousness, a gentle expanse where the expectations of others no longer invade your inner landscape. And in that space, you begin to understand that unbecoming was never meant to strip you bare for the sake of suffering, but to create room for the kind of truth that cannot coexist with pretense. You realize that authenticity does not arrive as a dramatic transformation, but as a soft and steady companionship, a quiet presence that meets you in each choice you make, guiding you not with certainty, but with resonance, with the subtle knowing that your inner world and outer life are no longer at war with each other. There is no triumphant finale, no cinematic ending where everything becomes clear. Instead, there is a gentle reorientation, a quiet turning toward the self you buried long ago, the self who waited patiently for you to tire of performing and to return home. You begin to sense that the real work of life is not to become extraordinary, but to become honest, to live in a way that does not fracture your spirit, to speak in a tone that does not betray your heart, to walk through the world without abandoning yourself at every threshold. And though the path ahead remains uncertain, you carry a softness into it, a steadiness, because you now understand that uncertainty is not a threat, but an invitation, a spaciousness where the next version of your life will take shape without the distortions of fear or obligation. You may lose people along the way. You may shed dreams that once defined you. You may watch entire chapters collapse under the weight of their own inauthenticity. Yet none of this feels like failure. It feels like alignment, like gently closing a door you were never meant to walk through in the first place. In this final reflection, you recognize that unbecoming is not a single act, but an ongoing rhythm, a lifelong return to your inner truth each time the world tries to pull you away from it. And the more you obey this rhythm, the more you sense a quiet strength rising within you, a strength rooted not in performance, but in presence. And as you take your first steps into the life that remains, you carry with you a simple, steady understanding that the self you once feared losing was only a shadow and the self that now emerges, tender and unfinished, is the beginning of a life finally lived from the inside outward, a life that does not demand your disappearance, but invites your return. There comes a point after the unraveling, after the shadows have been faced and the illusions set down gently like fragile artifacts from a former life, when you realize that unbecoming was never the destination but the quiet clearing of a path you had avoided for years, a path that leads not forward into reinvention, but inward toward a self you abandoned in the slow compromises of survival. Walking back into yourself is not a triumphant return. It is a delicate process of re-entering rooms you once locked, brushing dust from memories you buried intentionally, and relearning the texture of your own inner voice, which once spoke with clarity before it became drowned beneath the noise of living for others. You do not walk quickly, because quickness belongs to urgency, and urgency belongs to fear, and fear belongs to the world you are leaving behind. Instead, you move slowly, as if each step were an act of listening, as if you were learning again how to inhabit a body that has long been instructed to stay silent. This walk is unlike anything you've undertaken before, because for the first time there is no performance required, no audience evaluating, no invisible judge demanding refinement. There is only you and the faint echo of the self who waited, not with impatience, but with a kind of timeless faith, knowing you would eventually return when the burden of pretending became too heavy to carry. As you walk inward, you begin noticing things you once overlooked, subtle but profound signs that your life had been speaking to you long before you were ready to hear it, offering quiet opportunities to turn back toward yourself. Moments of discomfort you dismissed as inconvenience, flickers of intuition you silenced out of habit, small aches in your chest that surfaced whenever you drifted too far from your own truth. These signs do not accuse you, they welcome you, because the inner world is not vengeful, it is patient, and it understands that returning to yourself is not a matter of bravery, but of timing, of arriving at the precise moment when the old self's gravity finally weakens enough for you to slip out of its orbit. As you move deeper, you encounter the child you once were, not the chronological child, but the emotional one, the part of you who loved without calculation, who trusted without analysis, who felt deeply before being taught to numb. And this encounter is never easy, because it requires acknowledging how often you have abandoned the most tender aspects of your being in order to meet the demands of a world that never asked who you truly were. You sit with this younger self, not to heal them in a single gesture, but to listen, to let them tell the stories you tried to forget, to let them describe the moments when silence became survival and hiding became habit. And in their voice, you hear the origin of the patterns that shaped your adult life. There is a grief in this listening, a heavy and necessary mourning for the years spent protecting others at the cost of harming yourself. But within that grief, there is also a softening, a realization that your suffering was not weakness but loyalty, the misguided loyalty of a soul trying to remain lovable in a world that taught you love must be earned. The deeper you travel, the more you realize that authenticity is not found in acquiring new qualities, but in reclaiming ones you abandoned along the way. Curiosity, gentleness, imagination, stillness, longing, and the quiet belief that your existence was never meant to be a negotiation with the fears of others. Walking back into yourself means learning to trust your sensations again, the subtle tightening of your body around people who drain you, the expansion you feel around people who nourish you, the quiet dread that surfaces before commitments that betray your truth, the calm that settles when you choose alignment over approval. You realize how often your intuition tried to speak through these sensations, how often you dismissed them because your mind preferred the familiarity of old stories to the uncertainty of inner knowing. And this recognition is painful, but it also becomes the first lesson in the new language of self-trust you are beginning to learn. There is a slowness required here, a willingness to make choices not out of habit, but out of resonance, to ask before every action whether it contracts or expands your spirit, whether it leads you toward yourself or away. And though this questioning might seem small, it becomes the compass for an entirely new way of living. You begin to understand that every moment offers a choice between becoming and abandoning yourself, between repeating the past or stepping gently toward the future. And the more often you choose alignment, the easier the walk becomes, as if an inner path were clearing itself beneath your feet. Eventually you reach a point where the internal and external begin to mirror each other, where the changes within you subtly reshape the structure of your outer life, not through force but through inevitability, as relationships shift to reflect your growing honesty, as routines dissolve that were built on avoidance, as the commitments you once clung to begin to loosen when you no longer need them to justify your worth. Some people drift away quietly, sensing perhaps that the version of you they knew has dissolved, and though their absence may sting, it does not wound you in the same way it once would have, because you now understand that distance is not a loss when it creates space for truth. Other connections deepen, becoming more spacious and sincere, because your authenticity invites theirs, and relationships built on mutual truth do not fear change, they evolve with it. This restructuring is not something you control, it unfolds naturally as a consequence of choosing yourself in a world that taught you to choose everyone else first. And while it can feel disorienting, it also feels clean, like the air after a long storm, like the moment the noise finally fades enough for you to hear your own breath. As you continue walking, there comes a moment when you realize that you are no longer moving toward the self you abandoned. You are already standing within them. The fragmentation that once defined you begins to dissolve. The inner contradictions quiet. The old fears lose their urgency, and you feel, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, a sense of inhabiting your own existence without apology. This is not a state of bliss, it is a state of coherence, a deep internal alignment that does not erase pain but integrates it, does not eliminate uncertainty, but removes the shame around it, does not promise perfection, but offers something far more honest: presence. You begin to live without the need for explanation, without the compulsion to justify your choices, without the constant monitoring of other people's reactions, because your inner authority has finally grown stronger than your outer dependence, and in this reversal, your life begins to feel like something that belongs to you, rather than something you are borrowing from the expectations of others. Walking back into yourself is not a destination you reach, but a rhythm you learn. A daily practice of choosing truth over imitation, presence over performance, alignment over approval, and with time this rhythm becomes natural, as instinctive as breathing, as steady as your heartbeat. And when you look back, carefully, tenderly, you see that the journey was never about becoming someone new, nor about repairing someone broken, nor about rising into some idealized version of yourself. It was about returning to the self who existed before the world taught you to fracture, to hide, to shrink, to pretend. You see that unbecoming was simply the removal of everything that stood between you and your own essence, the gentle shedding of identities that were too small for the depth of your being, the dismantling of the walls built to protect you from a world you no longer need to fear. And in this realization, something profound settles within you, a quiet and enduring truth, that the self you were seeking throughout your entire life was never distant, never lost, never unreachable. They were simply waiting for you to stop running long enough to hear their voice. Walking back into yourself is the final act of remembering, the moment you return to the truth that has lived at the center of your being from the beginning. The truth that you do not need to become more in order to be enough. You only need to return to what has always been yours.